So everyone say 38 years.
38 years.
And everyone say, and one day. Because that's what I want you to remember, okay? 38 years and one day. All will become clear as we go on. All right. This chapter 5 has the fifth long conversation that we see in the book of John. You might remember, John isn't telling the whole story of Jesus. He's picking out specific incidents, which include 7 miracles and 7 types of long conversation, either with an individual or a group of people that he goes back to. And the fifth of the 7 conversations we find in this chapter. And we also find the third miracle. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. The first miracle, you might remember, was when Jesus changed water into wine. Now, why was that the first miracle that John picked up on? And it was showing the power of creation. In the beginning, God created. So the first miracle John wanted to pick up on was creation. But then it ramps up a little bit. The second miracle was healing a nobleman's son at a distance. Now, John said that he did many other miracles, but John didn't bother to talk about those. The second one he really honed in on was the time that Jesus first healed at a distance. So what we're looking for, as I tell the story, is why is today's miracle the third one that John chose to highlight? What's special about this that we need to learn from? Okay, so let's tell the story of chapter 5. There is a pool called, well, it depends which version you read. It could be called Bethesda or Bethsaida or Bethsaida, depending on exactly which manuscript you're looking at. I'm going to call it Bethesda. And at this pool, it says that people who were lame and blind and paralyzed would gather in large numbers. Now, this is a photograph of a model which is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and this is what they think it looked like. Okay, so where it says, if you read the description, this is what archaeologically they've found. This place exists in Jerusalem. It's a real place that the Bible is talking about. One of the reasons that we know the Bible is true is because we keep finding archaeological evidence that what it says is true. So, this was the pool, and something special might have been happening at this pool. I say might. Were there some healings going on? Because if we read the text, all these people are gathering there, and it says in verse 4, "For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stood at the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had." Now, you might know that story. But if you've got a more modern translation and you look for that verse in your Bible, it's not there. There might be a footnote that says this was added later, but in the older manuscripts, that verse isn't there. And what they think happens is this. In the story, Jesus goes to the man. He says, "Do you want to be made well?" We'll come to who the man was in a minute. And he says, "I do, but I can't get in the water fast enough." And everybody thought, at the time it was written, everybody says, "I know the story about this. There is the story that there were healings at this pool." But as time went on, people didn't know that story. And so it didn't make sense. So they think that what happened was they added a footnote, or a note at the side of the manuscript, so that when people were reading, it read, well, they think there was this angel that stirred the waters and the people got in. That was the story of the time. And then one day when people were copying it, they thought, well, let's not leave it at the side. Let's write it in the text. And gradually, that's the text that got copied. And that's why the more recent manuscripts have that verse, but the older ones don't. So here's the thing. Is actually God doing healings in this pool? We don't know for certain. There's no specific verse that says this thing about there was an angel and a healing really took place, well, that was the legend, that was the myth. But the Bible doesn't honestly say that it really happened. And to be honest, can you think of any other healing that is like this, where the ability to get healed is based on if you're well enough to move? I mean, that doesn't sound like God to me. If you look at the Old Testament, there's no healings like that. So there's a good chance that this was just like a myth, a story, a legend, and it meant that people gathered there. Now, why would they gather there if there were no healings, you might ask? There must be healings, otherwise why go there? Well, the answer is, people who were seriously ill, paralyzed, blind, how would they get what they needed? How would they get food? How would they get money? And the answer is, they would beg. And where do you go to beg? Well, you gather in places where people are going to be. And it's interesting that to the Jews, to give to someone who was in need was an act of worship. It wasn't just meeting their need, it was a way of worshiping God. And what they would do, a faithful Jewish person would give a portion of what they had, and they would go and find people in need and give them food and give them money as an act of worship. So if you went here, there was a pretty good chance that people would be coming to give you things. So there may have been healings, there may not. What we do know is there were a large number of people who were ill, infirm, blind, disabled, etc., who gathered at this pool. They stayed there. And we also know that one man there had not been able to walk for 38 years. Now this, the Bible text says, there was a man there who had not been able to walk for 38 years. We don't know if he'd never walked and he was 38 years old, or maybe he had an accident or an illness that took the use of his legs and he was older than 38 but just had 38 years of being unable to walk. But either way, this man was there and he was desperate. Because when Jesus came to ask him if he wanted to be made well, he didn't understand who Jesus was. And he says, well, I want to be made well, but the story is that I've got to get in the pool first. And when there's ever a rippling in the water, everybody dives in as quick as they can. Nobody can really see what's going on, but I tell you what, I can't get there. And I have no one to help me, he said. So this man is suffering. This man is desperate. This man has no one to help him. He's been surviving for 38 years on what he could get as a beggar. He is utterly trapped in his situation. No way out. And he has no hope. When somebody comes and talks about healing, he says, well, it's never going to happen, is it? He's a man with no hope for 38 years. And then one day, he met Jesus. 38 years and one day. He meets Jesus. And Jesus says, do you want to be made well? And he basically says yes. And then Jesus says, pick up your mat and walk. So he's lying down next to this pool in this porch, and Jesus says, pick up your mat and walk. And he gives it a go. And as he tries, suddenly his legs are made whole and he can walk. He is physically healed. We'll talk more about physical healings as we go along, because we're doing a whole series about this. But he was healed. Fantastic. 38 years, and then in one day, his life changed forever. Now, why did his life change forever? And you might think, well, because his legs have been healed. No. That is not the reason that his life has changed forever. That only affects your life on earth. So not because of physical healing was his life changed forever, Although fantastic, it's wonderful that he was healed, but he was made spiritually alive when he came to trust Jesus. That's when he gets eternal life. That's when he gets the assurance that he will go to heaven, that he knows that no matter what happens on this earth, his future is secure. And that changes your life forever. Which is great. But why is this one of the 7 miracles that John wants to point out? I mean, the other gospel writers have stories like this. John said he saw so many miracles, there were not enough books in the world for him to write them all down. So what's so special about this? I mean, it's great that he healed somebody who'd been ill, unable to walk for 38 years, so it was a long time, but is that it? I don't think it is. Let's carry on with the story and get towards the 5th conversation. And now I'm talking about the Sabbath. Okay? The Sabbath. So after he's been healed, we get these words, verses 9 to 10. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat. So it doesn't matter, he's been unable to walk for 38 years. The Pharisees don't care about that. They just say, why are you carrying your mat on a Saturday? Now bear in mind the Sabbath day, the holy day, the day of rest. For the Jews it was a Saturday. And they called it every week the Sabbath. And the Pharisees are angry because this man is breaking their rules. And if you want to know about Pharisees and rules, then part 4 of this series, when I was talking about Nicodemus, I explained more about that. So you can go back and check that out if you want to know more about Pharisees and rules. But what's God's rule? He was breaking the Pharisees' rules. Was it God's rule that he should not carry his mat on a Saturday? Well, this is the rule from Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, or your daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the foreigner within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So, there is a law about not working on the Sabbath day. And it's about not working too hard. That's what this rule is about. It's about saying you can't keep working 7 days, 7 days, 7 days without a day off. You need a day off. You will notice that rule said even your slaves, your servants, they have to be given a day off. God is saying this is important. You can't keep working all the time. This is a rule for you. Take a day off. But it's not about stopping people carrying mats, is it? And the Pharisees, they got a million extra bits to what you couldn't do on the Sabbath, on the Saturday. But that isn't what God's rule was about. Now, some people think this. Jesus could have gone to this place any day of the week. He could have healed anyone. But what he did was he waited till a Sabbath day. And he's looked for someone, first of all, who is in great need, but he picked someone who had a mat. And they said, oh, there's somebody in great need, and there's a mat, because I want to confront the Pharisees about their understanding of the Sabbath. So he says to the man, walk, and off you go. Oh, no, he didn't. He said, pick up your mat and walk. Jesus, knowing it was against the Pharisees' rules to carry a mat on the Sabbath day, tells someone to pick up their mat and go walk in. and heals them at the same time. And many people believe this is not an accident, that Jesus wanted to prove a point about something. And this leads us to the fifth type of long conversation that Jesus has. And that's with the Pharisees, with the religious leaders. This is not the only time he has one of these conversations. That's why I say it's kind of the fifth type of conversation, because he confronted them regularly. Now, the Pharisees believed only God can work on the Sabbath. You see, that command that we read from Exodus says God created the heavens and the earth in how many days? That's right, 6 days. And then on the seventh day he rested. And then when did he next rest? Well, there's nothing in this verse about the next time he rested. So 6 days, God rested, and since then, God has always been working. They understood that the world could not exist and hold together without the power of God. That when we come and worship, God is listening to us. God is answering prayers. God always is working. And if we read what the rabbis were saying at that time, they made it clear God only rested on the one time. He doesn't take a rest every Sabbath. He just took it the one Sabbath. We need a day off every 7 days. God keeps on working. And so the Pharisees are angry because Jesus is working on a Sabbath. And only God is allowed to work on a Sabbath. And Jesus says this: my Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working. In other words, he's saying, it's okay for me to work on a Sabbath because I'm God. You all know God can work on the Sabbath, and you are all saying God keeps working every day. Do you know what? I keep working every day because I too am God. And the response of the Jews in verse 18 is this: for this reason, the Jews tried all the harder to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God. Isn't it interesting how the Pharisees respond? If there is a challenge, what do they want to do? They want to kill you. Have you ever met someone like that? That if you challenge them, I mean, there are places in the world that we know, people here have experienced, that if you challenge the leaders, they will try and kill you. Or we might have experienced it, they try and attack you. Now, it should not be that way. I have said it before, I'll say it again. If you want to challenge what I say, that's okay. Never believe anything just because I say it. It is fine for us to try and understand and challenge and think about what we are doing. But the Jews knew exactly what Jesus was doing. He was telling him he was God. And that's why they said, we'd better kill him. So the third miracle in John is telling us that Jesus is confronting the Pharisees with the fact that he is God. And that's why I think John highlights it as a key miracle. He is gradually showing us step by step, Jesus really is God. So that's the story, and that's what we learn from what happened in the past. That's how we understand that story was meant in the time it was written. But it also means we need to ask a question, doesn't it? The question is, well, what should we do about the Sabbath? Because if there is this law in the Old Testament, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to obey that? Well, let's look. The first thing to remember is this: all the Old Testament principles, rules, and laws, they are all valuable. They all have a reason for being there. We don't completely ignore any of them, but we don't follow them as rules. Why do we not follow them as rules? Well, Matthew 22, verse 37 to 40, Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." In other words, Jesus said, you know all those laws in the Old Testament? And by the way, there's over 600 of them. You know all those 600? You think about the 10 commandments. No, there's 600. All those 600 rules. If you love God and you love people, you are fulfilling all of those rules. So you don't need to learn 613 individual rules. This is what you do. You love God and you love people. And that's it. He also, or Paul says in Colossians 2:16, "Do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day." In other words, if anyone comes up with a rule for the Sabbath day and you don't follow it, and they start saying, "Oh, you're not following the Sabbath rules properly," well, don't let them judge you, because there is no rule that we have to follow about the Sabbath day. There's no rule about what we eat and drink. There is no rule about exactly how we observe religious festivals. There is no rule about the Sabbath day. So, whatever we do is okay, because there's no rule. However, although there is no rule, there is a benefit by understanding why God said it. Do you remember what I said? All the Old Testament rules, principles, they all have value. They're not rules we have to follow, but if we understand them, they will help us. So there is an advantage to following this rule. Even though we don't have to, it's good for us. Mark 2, verse 27, Jesus said, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." In other words, God's rules about the Sabbath is not saying, "I want you to be holy and keep the day holy for my benefit." God is saying, "I'm telling you about this thing we're calling the Sabbath for your benefit. It's for your good." Which brings us to rest. The Sabbath rule is about rest. Modern life, we're all in modern life, and it's busy, isn't it? And we're busy with work, and we're busy with chores, and we're busy looking after family, and all those things. But then the mad thing is, we're also busy with entertainment. Oh, I've got a minute free. Let me check my phone. Let me have all these apps and things that are sending me videos. Oh, I've got 5 minutes. Let me watch some funny videos. Oh, I've finished my work for the day. Oh, let's watch telly for the rest of the night. Let's go out. Let's do something. Where is the rest? Incredibly, rest can sometimes be seen as a waste of time. I don't want to be resting. I want to be enjoying myself. Okay, have you ever heard people say, "I'll rest when I'm dead. I'm going to party. I'm going to enjoy life. I'm going to have a great time. And I'll rest when I'm dead. I'm going to keep going." Rest is not a waste of time. God tells us that rest is important. It was important enough that when of the 600 rules in the Old Testament, and by the way, how can you imagine that the Pharisees invented extra rules when there's already 600? Why would they invent extra ones? But they did. But of the 600 rules in the Old Testament, the 10 that get most attention, the 10 commandments, one of them is rest. Take a day off every week. It's important. 4 types of rest I want to talk about. Briefly, don't worry. Rest from work. Okay, the obvious one that this commandment is about. You rest from work. Continuous work is bad for our health. Many of you know my story, and I was a school teacher on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and I was a pastor on Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday. And I would do that until the next school holiday. So I would regularly work 5 weeks solid without a day off. And then I'd take 7 days off for the holiday. And I kidded myself, I was taking, on average, 1 day a week. Because I would work 5 weeks solid and then have 5 days off. So I thought, well, I'm basically fulfilling this rule, aren't I? And I wasn't. And I became ill. So now, I take 1 day off a week. Just so you know, my day off is usually Monday. I try and never do anything on a Monday. If you want to contact me on a Monday, I'd really appreciate it if you waited till Tuesday. Now, if you need it, if you need something, that's okay. If you're in a desperate situation and you need my help, fine, call me on a Monday, whatever. But if you don't need it, and you call me on a Monday, don't be upset if the first thing I say is, can this wait till tomorrow? Because it's my day off, all right? But practically, we need a day off every week. Second thing I want you to understand about rest is we need rest from stress. It's not just rest from work, it's rest from stress. Luke 5:16 says this, Jesus rarely withdrew, oh no, it doesn't say rarely, does it? It says often. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Okay, this is Jesus. This is Jesus who loves everybody, who wants to help everybody, and he often went away from the crowds to be by himself and to pray. Find times to switch off your phone and be alone with God. You know, sometimes you need to be alone and just chill. And sometimes in that time you are alone and you're also recognizing God, which is always important. God's with you all the time. You're not ever alone. And that's why I say, find time to be alone, but with God. In Matthew 6:34, it says, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. This is a discipline you can learn. If I am stressed on a day over something that I need to do or something that's going wrong, if on my day off I'm thinking I've got this to do this week and this to do this week and maybe I should start now. Maybe if I start now, it'll be easier later in the week. And I say, no, Ian, stop stressing. You need a day off. I'm not going to think about tomorrow. What's going to happen in the future? This is going wrong in my life. How is it going to turn out? Well, can I do anything about it now? If not, well, then I'm just not going to think about it. And you can talk to yourself. In your will, you can say, hang on, I am here on my day off stressing about thinking about work, thinking about family, thinking about a financial situation, thinking about problems at work. And you have to say to yourself, stop. I'm going to think about something else. Because in this moment, I can do nothing about that situation. So I am not going to worry about it. Jesus said, worry doesn't work. Whoever managed to grow taller by worrying? You can be the champion worrier, but you're never going to grow an inch taller. Worry does not make a scrap of difference to your situation. You can worry constantly for 24 hours. How does the situation improve? Not remotely. In fact, it gets worse because you're so stressed for worrying for 24 hours. So, There's a discipline here. And if you find it difficult, ask God to help you. God, give me a rest from stress. Help me to set those things aside. Let me think about some good things instead. You need rest from stress. Thirdly, thinking about the Sabbath. It is a spiritual day. It is a day that we can set aside to remind ourselves that the spiritual is more important than the physical. We are confronted by physical all the time. What we see, what we do, what we feel. But you know what? The spiritual is more important than the physical. And that's why it's great to come at least once a week to be with other Christians, to talk about God, to worship, to sing songs that remind us, to learn about Him, to pray, to connect with Him. Because it helps us have a pattern that we take ourselves away from the physical and the stress, and we say, this time is between me and God. And that's why it is good to come every week to the church building. Remember, you are the church. This is the building that we gather in. But it is good to be with each other at least once a week. And lastly, I want to talk about spiritual rest. Because there is something beyond the Sabbath day of rest once a week. Hebrews 4, verses 1 to 3 says, therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the gospel preached to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because those who heard did not combine it with faith. Now we who have believed enter that rest. Okay, you know the good news about Jesus. You've heard me talk about it. He's come to save the world. And people hear the good news. And some people have faith, they believe it, and they become Christians. And some people do not have faith, and it doesn't do them any good. Because they don't believe. Okay. But those of us who do believe, we enter a spiritual rest. Christians have already entered into a spiritual rest. Do you know how often I am at rest? 7 days a week. Now, it doesn't mean I don't do any work, but there is a spiritual rest that I have entered into. If you're a Christian, you have entered into a state of spiritual rest. Because you are already accepted. Do you know how hard people work to be accepted? To try and show others that they're good enough? To try and be liked by other people? And they spend so long on it. But I'm at rest. Because some people may accept me and some people may not accept me. But God accepts me. So I don't have to work everybody accepting me or anybody accepting me, because I'm at rest. I'm significant. Because I know God, I am significant. Do you know how hard people work to be significant? The things they try and achieve, the lists that they write on their CVs, the things that they say, I want to do something so that people will know me. They asked teenagers what they wanted to be when they grew up. Now, when I was a kid, they used to ask people my age. I'm 56, by the way. They used to ask, when you're a kid, depending on your age, people would say things like, I don't know, doctor, train driver, astronaut, whatever. They'd say a job. Do you know what most people say now, the kids? They say famous. What do you want to be when you grow up? Famous. What for? Doesn't matter. I want to be on YouTube. Maybe I'll be an influencer. Maybe I'll be a singer. Maybe I'll be a dancer. Maybe I'll be a sports person. What I want to be when I grow up? Significant. Famous. That's not a thing. I don't have to work at being significant. As a Christian, you don't have to work at being significant. If you don't do anything in this life that anybody points at and says you're a significant person, don't worry about it. Because in God, you are significant. You are already secure. Do you know how hard people work to try and have security? To try and get a better job? To try and get some money? To try and have things around them that protect them? And hey, I do those things too. But am I secure in those things? No. Because they can disappear in an instant. You can lose your health in an instant. You can lose your money in an instant. I look at all this thing that's happening with cryptocurrency. And all these people who've invested their life savings in cryptocurrency. And then the market crashes and they've lost all their money. And now they're saying, somebody should give me my money back. It's not my fault I invested in a stupid investment. Give me my money back. Everything they had in security, gone like that. People work hard to find security. Do you know what? As a Christian, I'm already secure in God. If the rest of my life is chaos and problems and difficulties, I go to heaven for eternity in perfection. My future is utterly, totally secure in God. And I've gone through good times in life and I've enjoyed it and I've said thank you, God. And I've gone through hard times in life that I have hated and I have said, not thank you for this, God, but thank you that I'm secure anyway. No matter how this situation turns out, when I was too ill to work because I worked too hard, well, I was still secure in God. And I would pray and say, God, I feel awful today. I don't know if I'll ever be able to work again. I may never recover physically, but I'm secure in you and I'm going to go to heaven. So even if this never gets better on earth, it's going to get better in heaven. We are already secure. And that's why I've already entered a spiritual rest 7 days a week, because I'm already accepted, significant, and secure. God is for you. He is not against you. He already loves you as much as he can. What can you do to make God love you more? Nothing. People think if I behave better, if I give more money, if I volunteer more time, if I pray harder, if I learn the Bible, hey, if I do these things, God will love me more. No, he won't, because he already loves you as much as is possible. So it's the enemy who tries to tell you that you're not good enough. It's the enemy who tells you you have to work harder. The enemy does not want you at rest. God wants you to know you are already in spiritual rest. And of course, daily connection with God helps you stay in that rest. So when I read the Bible and I pray, which I do most days, I'm not perfect, sometimes I don't, but I do most days, and that helps me stay connected with God. Am I doing it because it's work? No, it's not work to me. I'm doing it, it's good for me, but it keeps me connected to God and the rest that I have in him. So, how do we respond to all this? It's called 38 years and one day. Let's look at the one day. The one day starts with a Sabbath rest 1 day a week. If you don't do that, you're asking for trouble. There's not a rule in the Bible that says you have to take a day off, but if you don't, you're heading for trouble. We gather as a church because it's good for us, not because we have to. So there's no rule that says we have to come to the church building and gather as church every single week. There's no rule that says you have to, but it's so good for us to do it. And if we don't, then it will affect us negatively. So that's why it's good to come on that 1 day a week. Obviously, we connect with God every day, but it's good to connect as church. What's the 38 years then? Well, for the man, the 38 years was 38 years of a physical disability, of isolation, of desperation, of no hope. And 38 years might represent for you a long struggle that you're going through. Something you are desperate about. A situation where you have lost hope. Because it can happen. Even as a Christian, we can be going through a hardship, a difficulty, and the burden is heavy. And we're struggling. It's the truth. But in one day, God can bring you spiritual rest and a change in physical circumstances. However long, whether it's 38 years or 48 years or 58 years or 1 year or 6 months, however long the struggle is, there is all that, and one day it all changes.